The so-called pastoral letters are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. That label originated in the 18th century and has stuck to them ever since. Although, ironically, these letters are less pastoral than Paul's letters to congregations, which are basically the rest of his corpus. These letters' topics fall into several broad categories: sound living and faith for the recipients and for the whole congregations under their care, leadership tasks, falseness, false teachers and their false ways of life, and the perennial mission and calling of the gospel and the kingdom. Just about every New Testament survey treats these letters together, often in the same chapter. But do they really cluster together so closely and so exclusively? Not necessarily. Here's a game I'm going to use to make my point. It's called Set. It involves a deck of unique cards which match in several attributes, but never in all attributes. And the object of the game is, with the cards that you have, to make a set of 3. Here are some of those cards. I've helpfully arranged them so that you can see the obvious set right in the middle of the screen. All 3 are squiggles, all 3 are white, all 3 have outlines of the same color. They only differ in the number of squiggles. This is how New Testament surveys typically treat the pastoral letters, as an obvious set of these 3. And they are a set of these 3 if you group them that way. But if you choose to focus on different similarities, you will see different sets. On the left, 3 white single squiggles with different colored outlines. In the bottom center, 3 triple squiggles, all purple but with different inside fillings. On the right, 3 double squiggles, all purple but with different fills. So for now, let's hold loosely the idea that these 3 letters should be clustered in ways that aren't true of other possible clusters. A second feature of the common approach is to treat all of these letters as products of the same time in Paul's ministry, usually at the end of his ministry. Or, for critics who think Paul didn't write them, all products of the same school of disciples operating after Paul's death. But do they all belong necessarily to the end of Paul's career, or even the same stage in Paul's career? Not necessarily. A third reason, for those who don't think Paul wrote them, is that their authorship is disputed. Are these letters really so different from classic Paul? Yes and no. Contemporary critical scholarship is very good at pointing out the resemblances that gave us that first set of 1, 2, and 3 white squiggles. But that approach trains us not to see the correspondences that we could use in associating these letters in different ways. So, is critical scholarship helping? Yes and no. Let's look in greater depth at those factors that are so influential in the contemporary modern approach to gauge just how we should approach these letters. Factor 1, do they really cluster together? Here, I find New Testament scholar Luke Timothy Johnson's analysis very helpful. Here's a chart you see elsewhere. The New Testament canon arranges Paul first in letters to congregations, longest to shortest, more or less, and then secondly, letters to individuals, longest to shortest. For appropriate reasons, Philemon ended up associated with Colossians, and that left the other 3 letters addressed to individuals. And Enlightenment scholars grouped them together as the so-called pastorals and focused on what they had in common. But Johnson notes that 2 Timothy's concerns line up pretty well with Philippians. There's so much in common between those 2 letters. And its style sounds more like Paul's classic style than either 1 Timothy or Titus. Moreover, 1 Timothy's agenda looks rather like 1 Corinthians: decency and order, right authority versus contested authority, and suppressing false teachers as well as their teachings. The agenda of Titus is in the mainstream of the agendas of Paul's travel letters. Those are 1 and 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, and Romans. If we weren't grouping the so-called pastorals together all the time, we'd see more clearly that we could draw different associations and see different resemblances. Second factor, do they belong to the end of Paul's ministry or beyond that? Well, if we assume, at least for the sake of argument, that Paul did write them, they need not. Philippians is likely written in the late 50s to early 60s, which is near the end of when Luke is chronicling Paul's ministry. And 2 Timothy shares a lot in common with it. Both talk about Paul's life being poured out like a drink offering. He sounds weary. He sounds ready to retire in both letters. The description of Timothy in 1 Timothy and Titus matches the way Timothy is described in 1 Corinthians 4:17, 1 Corinthians 16:10-11, Philippians 2:19-23, and 1 Thessalonians 3:2. Again, if we're assuming that Paul is behind these letters, then there's no particular reason to put them later in Paul's career. The description of Titus in his letter matches the description of Titus elsewhere in the New Testament. He's helpful, but he's not so close personally. He doesn't have quite the intimate relationship that Paul and Timothy have as co-workers. He's more of a trusted colleague or a deputy. There's a common construction that's really distinct in 1 Timothy and Titus, where Paul says, "This saying is sure." Paul says, "This saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners." This kind of thing shows up again in 1 Timothy 3:1, and here in 4:8. While bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. Verse 9, "The saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance." You also see this in Titus 3:7, as well as 2 Timothy 2:10. So this is one reason why people cluster these together in the set that you usually see. They could be coming from a later era in the church's development, but they often represent pretty commonsensical stuff. I mean, Jesus came into the world to save sinners. That's not radical in any stage in Paul's ministry. So they would also fit nicely in earlier stages of Paul's ministry. They're the kind of nuggets that are perennially circulating, less formally, in Christian circles that are worth endorsing. Like some of the better lines of contemporary Christian worship songs that are in circulation at the moment. A preacher could take one of those in a sermon and say, "That's right," and get behind it the way that Paul seems to be getting behind sayings in 1 Timothy and Titus and 2 Timothy. Another reason these are often put at the end of Paul's ministry is that 1 Timothy and Titus's directions on church order, or polity, are often dressed up as formal roles in an increasingly hierarchical, formalized church. So the letters grouped together are often said to emphasize hierarchy and structure. In fact, some Protestant critics like to characterize the outlook in these letters as early Catholicism, and that's not a polite term. That means that the church is already drifting into the kind of hierarchy that the Protestant Reformation is going to try to save it from. But here are a couple problems with that. First, 2 Timothy doesn't address church polity. It doesn't come up there. Secondly, these labels, elder, presbyter, deacon, are named after earlier eras. Presbyters, which means elders, are mentioned in Acts 11:30, and Jewish elders are named throughout Luke Acts. They're just a feature of the Jewish religious landscape. Elders are also mentioned in James 5:14, which isn't considered a particularly late letter. Bishops, and the word bishop just comes from the Greek word for supervisor, episkopos, supervisor. Supervisors are mentioned in Philippians 1:1. Let someone take Judas Iscariot's place as supervisor. They're mentioned in Acts 1:20 and Acts 20:28. And deacons, and the word deacon is just the Greek word diakonos, servant. Servants are mentioned in Romans 16:1 and Philippians 1:1. The responsibilities for each of these positions don't sound terribly developed, and the standards that qualify you for the role of a bishop, a supervisor, or a servant, a deacon, are pretty ordinary, commonsensical, not violent, not adulterous, not a substance abuser. So in these passages, Paul could just be norming arrangements that already exist in these churches that are borrowed from synagogues, which would make natural sense as how Christians would organize themselves in the first couple generations. So these directions on church polity work as well in the fluid environment of the embryonic Greco-Roman church as they do in the much more formalized environment of the 2nd century with a monarchical episcopate, which is fancy language for one bishop for all the churches in each town. And in any event, these directions have proved useful for churches of all kinds, whether they have bishops or whether they are Baptists with autonomous congregations. Everyone has been able to use these directions. So they don't lend themselves only or even primarily to a late context.